All right, welcome, folks. I imagine we'll have more people trickle in as we get going here, but we might as well get started because we have a packed conversation for you all. So welcome, happy Friday. We're here in the third week of BARI Conference 2021, Building Back Smarter. We have a really exciting keynote, at least I'm really excited for it, on the 10th anniversary of BARI, looking back and forward. Before we get to that conversation, I just want to remind everybody that we have a final closing keynote next Friday. It's going to be a really special session. It's going to be a conversation with mayoral candidates led by Philip Martin from WGBH. And we'll be talking with candidates Barros, Campbell, Santiago, and Asabi George about research, policy, collaboration, and work under their administration. So please join us for that as well. But turning to today's keynote, I want to turn it over to Dean Uda Poiger of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University, which is where BARI lives, to give some opening thoughts and welcome you all to today's conversation. So with that, I'll give it to the Dean.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for your leadership of BARI over these last few years and for being one of the founding figures in this exciting initiative, which is a partnership, as I'm sure you all know, between Harvard University and Northeastern University that now lives actually in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and has a very strong link also to our School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, where Dan is appointed jointly with our School of Criminology and Criminal Justice as well. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to this session of Building Back Smarter, which, as Dan already mentioned, is at the same time the 10th anniversary celebration for the Boston Area Research Initiative. BARI, for short, fits very well into the broader mission of what we have articulated as the experiential liberal arts at Northeastern, and especially in the work that we do in the social sciences, humanities, and in policy. There are two important characteristics that I would just like to point all of you to. One is conducting community-engaged research and bringing our students into that mission. I think all of you know that Northeastern is a cooperative education university, and students from undergraduates to master's students, also doctoral students, are brought into our experiential learning opportunities. And in general, and especially in a college such as ours, that really means an emphasis on doing responsible community engaged work. And that's certainly at the heart of the DNA of BARI as well. The second characteristic that is so very important is one that I think the world, certainly more broadly, needs much more of, and that is connecting diverse data sets as well as using new digital tools for impactful research towards improving communities, and at the same time having those communities also, again, in a true fashion of community engaged work, having those communities in fact also shape the questions that we ask of those data sets, that they actually shape also those very data sets themselves. Among the civic duties of universities is no doubt the duty to contribute our expertise to the cities and communities where we are located. And of course, that has always been central to the Boston Area Research Initiative's mission. One example of current work that is exciting, there's many projects always in parallel, is a project on the differential impact of COVID in Boston area communities. I know something that is a concern, of course, not just in this area, but really globally as well. And at the same time, let me stress something else that Dan, as director, as well as the founding directors, have always, Chris Winship and Rob Sampson have always stressed. And that is that, of course, collaboration with communities is incredibly important for asking and answering the important questions of social equity and the ways in which we can bring data in order to make progress there into the picture. That collaboration is also very important among university partners in that context. And certainly BARI is founded on a collaboration. I'm just very proud also that BARI, especially with this conference, but with many of its other activities, is always very much committed to collaborations among Boston area universities, as well as Boston area public service agencies and Boston area nonprofit institutions. So in a sense, I think BARI does what academia needs to do much more of. And I think the anniversary panel that we are seeing today certainly very well personifies it when I look at the diverse institutional sets of belonging that our panelists this morning are in fact representing. I also just want to say that I'm very excited about the conversation with the Boston mayoral candidates that Dan previewed for you already briefly. And again, I think it's another sign of the kinds of possibilities that BARI has opened up. BARI, with its conferences, with its panels, is one important convener for thinking about the connections between research and policy in the Boston area more broadly. So congratulations then, Dan, to you, Chris and Rob, and to everybody who has been involved with BARI on your 10th anniversary, on our 10th anniversary. And without further ado, it's my great pleasure then to turn the mic over to Chris Winship, who's Diker Tishman Professor of Sociology at Harvard, and who was one of the two founding directors of BARI. Chris, could we turn to you?
Thank you very much, Uda. Wow, so it seems unbelievable that it's 10 years now. How time flies when you're productive and having fun. So the idea of BARI, though, started way back in the early 2000s. First in conversation between myself and David Luberoff, who was then executive director of the Rappaport Institute at Harvard. Then in 2003, Rob Sampson came to Harvard. He had been co-director of a very large, highly successful project at the University of Chicago that focused on that city. And we started talking about how we might launch something like BARI. And it was a number of years, a number of fits and starts, a number of efforts to try to figure out how you would make something like BARI happen. And then fortunately in 2009, Rob was appointed Dean of Social Science at Radcliffe. And then in conversations with then Dean Barbara Gross, BARI was launched with Radcliffe's quite substantial support. And then that was continued under Dean Liz Cohen for a total of 5 years. And so Radcliffe was at the beginning of really helping BARI get off the ground. And then today it's really been Northeastern that's provided fundamental funding. Now, BARI was founded, at least to my perspective, on 5 key points, and they echo exactly many of the points that Uda just made. First is, Boston has academic resources that far exceed that of any other city in the world. And in terms of doing locally focused research, those resources are amazingly underexploited. Second is that if one is concerned in solving the world's problems, this was part of the conversation with Dean Gross, one should be concerned with problems of one's local community. Third, that social science research can often be done best locally as one has the opportunity to analyze situations that one knows and can examine it firsthand. Fourth, as the dean emphasized, Boston's universities and college are among the city's region's most important corporate citizens, and such have a responsibility to be active contributors. And that as researchers, we can best contribute working in equal partnership with cities and communities to develop top quality research that informs public policy. I would say then one underlying theme for BARI that has existed throughout is this notion of that we are full and equal partners. The academics are not the experts here. We are here to work with both people in the city and local communities to develop research that really pushes the public agenda forward. So what I'm now going to do is we're going to move to a montage that contains messages from numerous people who have been involved over the past decade with BARI. And so with that, let's see what they have to say, both about BARI's past and about its potential for the future.
I'm Barbara Gross from Harvard University. Rob Sampson, then director of the Social Science Program in Radcliffe Institute's Academic Ventures, brought to me, I was then dean, the idea of the program supporting the launch of a partnership between academia and city policymakers. Rob made evident the potential for meaningful and successful policy development offered by data-driven research undertaken collaboratively by social science scholars and city governments. Providing seed funding for such an effort was a no-brainer. It was high risk and required cross-disciplinary cooperation and thus neutral turf to establish. Exactly the kind of effort Academic Ventures has aimed to make happen. I'm thrilled the Boston Area Research Initiative has flourished and by all it has accomplished. Congratulations. Thanks to all of you who brought about these successes and wishes for many more decades of a successful partnership.
In February of 2010, when I was the head of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, I went to the Jeremiah Burke High School to hear Tom Menino announce the launch of Boston's Circle of Promise, which was loosely modeled on the Harlem Children's Zone. The mayor said this effort would be informed by a laser-like focus on data. Over the course of his brief remarks, he repeated that phrase, laser-like focus on data, at least 3 more times. I was happy to hear of the mayor's interest in data, but I was also surprised. I had known Tom Menino since 1984, and before that morning, I had never heard him say, laser-like focus on data. A few days later, I got an unexpected call from sociologist Rob Sampson, who was involved with the Academic Ventures program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Rob wanted to discuss whether, and under what circumstances, officials in Boston might be willing to help researchers access the growing amounts of digitized data that were held by various city departments and agencies. I remember thinking, finally, all of the pieces are in place for a meaningful research policy collaboration in Boston. If we can't make this happen now, we'll never be able to make it work. Happy birthday, BARI.
Hi, I'm Liz Cohen. I'm a 20th century urban historian at Harvard, and I was fortunate enough to be dean at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies starting in July 2011, and to see BARI grow up. And I'm so proud of what it has become 10 years later. When I came in as dean, Barbara Gross had already been in touch with Rob Sampson and David Lubroff and Chris Winship to launch BARI. And then Dan O'Brien soon joined thereafter as a postdoc, and look how he has really become so important in this project. When I think back on some of the most important contributions that BARI made during my Radcliffe deanship, I remember 2 wonderful conferences. The first was really a breakthrough conference where city officials and university researchers were on panels together tackling some of the most important issues and challenges that Boston faced around policing, around planning, around health policy. It was really a wonderful event. And the second conference took place at a city building down at the Seaport, and that was my first view of Mayor Walsh in person. It was another very exciting event. So as we come to this 10th year anniversary, I just want to wish BARI all the best for another wonderful 10 years and to say that we'll all be watching with great enthusiasm.
When I think about the past 10 years of data-driven research and policy collaboration in Boston, I think of the evolution of Boston's 311 system and the insights it's given to the research community. Starting from the mayor's 24-hour hotline through several versions of Citizens Connect, all the way up to the current unified system we have today, 311 is a great example of how government has used technology informed by research to better serve the community. Along the way, the system has generated data that's taught us not just about where there are streetlights or sidewalks that need to be fixed, but about how people interact with their community, their neighborhood, and their government. It's shown us some of the intricacies of how we as Bostonians feel ownership and stewardship of our city, and it's brought government service delivery a little bit closer to the community it's meant to serve.
My introduction to BARI and Dan is almost 10 years ago now, when we looked at 311 data during our hurricane and the impact it had on the city's resilience. The marriage of data and policy and storytelling was so impactful that we've gone on and done amazing other collaborations together too. I think about this work and how it's changed how the city deploys resources for sidewalks in a more equitable manner, or just this year, how we utilize EMS data during a pandemic. I can't wait to see what the next 10 years brings to this team. And thank you, BARI, for all of your work and all of the collaborations that we've had together.
Happy 10th anniversary, BARI. My favorite project in the last 10 years is surely the Opportunity Index. I love the Opportunity Index because it was about reducing inequities. It was about moving money to where children are based on the needs that they have. It was truly collaborative between the universities and the school district, but it was also integrative in that it included data not only from the school and from the city and from the census, but also public health data. And so it was an integration of data from multiple sources to be used to systematically move money to schools where kids are to meet their needs. It is truly a research practice partnership. Happy anniversary.
The best measure of culture change is all of the extraordinary young people who are inspired to go work in local government. You know, I think back to my own time working for Mayor Menino, and I'm every day inspired by the work of people like Nigel Jacob and Chris Carter and Chris Osgood. And now I think of a new generation, folks like Lindsay Butler and Dan Lesser and Taylor Kane from Boston University. And every summer, I think of this wealth of talent of undergrads and graduate students who want to go do internships in the city of Boston, who may someday go on to work for the city. And I think if there's any one thing that is the best measure of culture shift, it's having legions of young people across the entire city who are inspired to go work in public service. That to me is the best possible measure of success.
For me, a quintessential BARI moment took place in late 2020, when in response to a series of requests from tenant advocates working to prevent evictions, we collaborated with Forrest Hangen from Northeastern University, who had already created a set of sophisticated analytical tools that cut through all of the LLCs and shell corporations behind which landlords hide, and enabled us to assemble a list of landlords responsible for an outsized share of evictions in the past, so that they could be targeted for immediate outreach and potential interventions. And this small example encapsulates the necessary linkage between community needs, public agencies, and cutting-edge academic research that is essential in order to address our region's most pressing challenges. And I look forward to more collaborations like this with all the BARI partners over the coming 10 years.
Hello, I am Amy Sprung from Microsoft. Happy 10th anniversary to BARI. In the next 10 years, I am most excited about the increased use of data for research and policy. Data has always been critical to research, and I'm excited to see data becoming crucial to policy creation and implementation. Policymakers will benefit from improved access to data, increased computing power to process large amounts of data, and thoughtful methods to ensure ethical use of data.
As a region, we've gotten so much more sophisticated at making data available to the general public, to local researchers, to policymakers, and that work is due in no small part to the great leadership of BARI. To me, what's most exciting about the next phase of work is doing more analysis of the data in a way that's accessible to the broader public, that's useful for policymakers, for legislative staff, for staff at City Hall, so that data-informed decision-making just becomes more of a regular course of action.
In the next 10 years, I'm most excited to see all of the young civic researchers who are coming up out of their colleges, universities, and communities. I think that there are a ton of young folks out there, as demonstrated by MetroLab's Student Cup that we held this past year in 2020, where folks are really thinking through the collaborations with their local communities, the tools that civic research can afford, and the type of impact that they can have locally and even in a more global scale.
Cities can be isolating places, siloed by sector, race, and class. To ask the hard questions about the future of cities requires that we think differently about how we think. That means we need arrangements that promote collaborations, which is the basic infrastructure for smart cities. We need opportunities for safe exploration, sideways thinking about routine or persistent problems. The first 10 years of BARI has given us the opportunity to practice collective discovery through conferences, research incentives, data sharing, and a load of other means. But the second 10 years of BARI should keep pushing us to collaborate, to invent new mechanisms of discovery and create new learning cultures to push us towards, I think, what we can all agree is a smart Boston, one that is data informed and people driven.
It is my privilege to introduce the moderator to today's panel, Dan O'Brien, BARI's director. Dan, as many of you know, is the heart and soul of BARI. The key ingredient in any successful effort is having the right person in charge. Dan, most obviously, has been the right person. Certainly, BARI would not be what it is today without Dan. It might not even exist. Dan received his PhD in evolutionary biology in 2010 from Brigham University in New York. One of the most interesting points in BARI's early history was Rob Sampson deciding and convincing me that Dan was the right person to hire as a postdoc, despite being a PhD in biology. Rob was right. Dan, in addition to being BARI's director, is now an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern. He has authored dozens of articles, many in top social science journals, and he has received over a dozen grants. His book, The Urban Commons, published by Harvard University Press in 2018, established him as a leading national expert on urban informatics. The book represents the intersection of his scholarly and institutional efforts using the study of custodianship for neighborhood spaces infrastructure through Boston's 311 system to illustrate the potential for data-based cross-section collaborations. Dan, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. It was a very generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Dean Poiger, for leading us off this morning. And thank you to everyone, those in the audience who were in the montage and those who are not in the audience, but thank you so much for doing that with us. I thought that was a special way for us to be able to kind of kick off this conversation. But with that said, let's jump right in. We have a fantastic panel this morning, and it's going to be very much a conversation about, well, looking backwards and looking forward simultaneously. So I'm going to introduce folks roughly in the order that I met them, I believe. So first up, we've got Rob Sampson, Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, and also, as you've already heard repeatedly, the founding director of BARI, and quite frankly, one of the two people who gave me the job that has now become where we stand today. Second, we have Nigel Jacob, co-founder and co-chair of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics in the city of Boston, and very possibly one of BARI's first, let's call it 5 co-conspirators back in 2011. Holly St. Clair, Chief Technology Officer at Sasaki Incorporated. But before that, she was the Director of Data Services at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and then subsequently Data Officer, and then the Chief Digital Officer for the Commonwealth, both of which she was the first to hold those positions in the Baker administration, and also someone that we've been working with for years and years. And then last, Amari Jefferies, who is the Executive Director of King Boston. He's the newest arrival to this conversation in a sense, but he himself has a ton of experience leading nonprofits and thinking about collaboration and advocacy locally, including Parenting Journey, Boston Rising, Jumpstart, and Friends of the Children. And so this is our panel for this morning. And so I'm really excited to have a great conversation to share thoughts with you all. Of course, the Q&A is open as well. If you want to shoot things over to us, we'll be paying attention to it. But I want to start with the first question. Now, so the audience understands two things to start with. First off, I'm going to use the word we a lot. And when I use that, I'm not referring to BARI as like the staff at BARI. I'm referring to us, the broader research policy community that's been working together for all this time, that's really made all of this possible as a collaborative venture. And the second thing is the panelists did not see that montage in advance, in part because we all agreed we wanted them to have a fresh response to it. So I'm going to start with Rob. What stood out to you most as you watched that? What's your immediate reaction?
So first of all, hi everyone. My first reaction, it was great. It was really wonderful to watch and bring back some memories. But a couple things stood out for me. One is the power, I would argue, of investing in risky ideas, risky ventures. Because as Chris noted earlier, when we were grappling early on with this, it was in fact inchoate idea, had a lot of moving parts, and it was risky. And I give a lot of credit to Deans Gross and Cohen and to the Radcliffe Institute. And interestingly, the program, Academic Ventures, fits very nicely, I think, with the origins of BARI in terms of giving it that jumpstart. And we should think more about that, I think, generally. We're used to, I think, the idea of startups in the world of Silicon Valley and economics, but this is a different kind of startup, right? This is investing in ideas. And in particularly, I mean, I've been an academic all my life, and that is to say, academics are, let's face it, pretty narrow in the sense of the silos that we put up. And so the idea of collaborating meaningfully with other institutions, right? First of all, right? Universities are silos. So inter-university collaboration, but then collaboration with the community, that came up a lot, the importance of community. Collaboration with government. I'm looking at Nigel here on the screen, who goes way back. Tremendous interactions. And I think there was a lot of faith, in other words, from multiple partners that this could work. So that's really my main reaction, is both appreciation, but also looking back, a little bit of surprise that so many different entities, the government, the NINO, community organizations, universities, were willing to sort of pony up and live with working out this idea. So that's my big reaction. I have some other thoughts on data, but I'll let others.
All right, thank you, Rob. Nigel, what was your first reaction?
Well, first of all, now that I've heard Rob's comments, I love everything Rob said, as I usually do. The other reaction, I reacted especially, I mean, it's really gratifying to have like old friends saying such lovely things about this work. But I think that in particular, the last 2 or 3 speakers on the montage, I think there was something implied there that wasn't quite said. That is what stood out to me, and I think that I've said this to you, but I think that the secret sauce of BARI is actually the relationships that we have, right? I think obviously the data is the engine that drives things, but the enabling conditions here are the fact that we know each other so well. Right. So I think this is when I look at, a lot of our work brings us into conversation with other cities around the country, around the world. And this is unique, what we have here. The fact that I can call up a famous, social scientist kind of on the fly is a superpower that most other cities don't have. And so, the relationships that we have, across everyone that's spoken, both on the montage and everyone that's on the panel is so rich. And I think it forms like a foundation for utilizing the data that we have access to in new and interesting ways, and to interrogate it in unusual ways. And so that was what was left to me. The fact that I have good relationships with so many people that have spoken so far on the montage and that are on the panel too. That's what stood out for me.
Great, thanks, Nigel. Holly, what were your reactions?
It was really good to hear and see everybody and think about how things have changed over the past 10 years. And as one of sort of the arrivers and sort of the data-informed approach to policy that more of us have taken more lately, it was really hard to access. At that time, I was the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in government, and it was really hard to access some of the academic experts that were around. And you knew that you were doing work that needed to be informed by the most recent thinking and research. It was just really hard to figure out who do you connect with and how. And so I feel like BARI really answered this need to connect all these different pieces of the puzzle in one place, and also then make things more accessible, not just the experts, but the data, the research, the students, and then also connect them back to us as practitioners and the communities that we're trying to improve and work with. And there was this respect given to the community members that didn't often always come from academics. So I really value the balance between the academics and the data and the community, and really thinking about what are the questions we all need to ask together and how do we best answer them. And that's something that I think BARI's really just continue to excel at, and is something that's sorely needed in this day and age.
Thanks, Holly. Amari, what were your reactions?
Hey, Dan, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be with this amazing panel and be, in some small form, a part of BARI's history, present, and hopefully future. And, a couple things that popped to mind for me, I was thinking about the concept of Sankofa, which is looking back to move forward. And it was incredible to hear the stories and see some of the history and some of the folks who were responsible, the architects of this movement, to engage data, community, and the power of connectivity to make social change, community change. And so to see and hear and understand who was involved in that feels like an important milestone and piece to be a part of. And then I think I was also struck by, there was a comment around Mayor Menino, and I'm closer to 50 than I am anything else these days, and as far as my age, and so I haven't known that many mayors in the city of Boston, and so I got a little nostalgic, and I was thinking about this moment in time. As I was listening to those remarks and thinking, 20 months ago, if any one of us were on a conference call, if we had that technology, and our cat jumped on the screen, or if our kid was in the background, we'd be embarrassed, we'd be apologizing. And now people's cats jump on the screen and we don't flinch, and kids jump in the screen and we spill our drinks on ourselves, and it doesn't even register now. And I hope this casualness around how we engage with technology and with each other is one of the things we bring forward. And this thing around perfectionism and white supremacy culture and what we thought was okay and acceptable, then we leave behind, because we have this opportunity with this hard restart on the pandemic. And thinking about the comments on Mayor Menino, I couldn't help but contextualize that thinking at that time, and what an opportunity we have right now to choose what we're going to bring forward and understand and respect and honor what we needed to do at the time. But also making it clear that we don't have to bring some of those things forward that were practices, that this organization has been a trailblazer in the work, and we get to choose what we're going to bring forward, and actually we get to redefine it. And so I think that struck me in the video, was seeing this opportunity to redefine it but also contextualize where we had come over the last 10 years. And even before that, I mean, the folks who've been doing this work had been doing this work before BARI existed. They just got the opportunity to execute on that thinking and work at BARI. So I'm really excited about what's next. Really, really honored to be a part of our past, and just thinking about learning from other folks on this panel.
That's great, Amari. I love those thoughts, and I love your idea, the Sankofa, right? And in a sense, right, exactly what we were trying to do this morning, right? Look back to move forward. And to your point of capitalizing on the current moment, I want to look back for a moment, because it was funny. Everybody in their own way spoke about how, as of 2010, 2011, 2012, this whole thing was sort of, Rob, I liked your word, inchoate, right? It just hadn't coalesced. It hadn't become a thing yet. The pieces were floating around. And I mean, I personally remember sitting in Chris Winship's office in December 2010. Here I am, young guy trying to find a postdoc. And Chris basically said to me, so there's this thing going on, and right, it's a little bit researchers, it's a little bit policymakers, and there's some data in the middle, and somehow we got to fit these jigsaw puzzle pieces together. And well, we'll hire you to pilot it. And if it comes together, that's great. You have a job. And if it doesn't come together, there's no job for you to want to have. And well, when you don't have a job yet, that also reads as, figure out how to fit these jigsaw puzzle pieces together, kid. So that's where we went from there. But I want to jump back over to Holly, because Holly, you really were pointing out, and I think in some ways you were there before many of us in this space, where you were trying to figure out, well, how does this come together, and when does this come together? What for you was the moment, like an example or kind of a shift where you realized, like, this is possible now, right? This is coalescing in a way that I know what to do with.
Goodness, that's a really interesting question. I think, gosh, I'm trying to remember the first time we met, Dan, but I think, one of the things that was really interesting, so looking back 10 years, it was in 2011 that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council released the State of Equity report card for Metro Boston. And in that, I looked at so many different research papers and so many different efforts that all of us were trying to do. And I just was really struck in particular by all the different housing policies. And at that time, the social determinants of health was sort of new in the planning arena. And so really trying to think about how to fit those pieces together, and thinking about who we can talk to at Harvard, who we could talk to at MIT. I think, Dan, we had some conversations, and others. And it just suddenly there were people there that we could talk to. And I just remember thinking, okay, like, this is going to work. We can have people that we can talk to about these things and review these and make these new connections. And we can be there as government right alongside them if, engaged in these conversations. So, and that, I think the other thing that I think is really invaluable, especially now, is my aha moment every time I come to the meetings is what people don't know is, and it sounds so mundane, but it's so powerful. At the beginning of the meetings, we each share what we're working on. But it is so interesting. And so just someone's usually just a step ahead of you, already thinking there, and they're already researching it. So like they're already asking the questions you're asking. So instead of asking the same questions over and over again, which is what we were sort of doing separately before BARI, we started to ask the questions together and then start to build upon each other instead of be redundant in our work. So I think that sort of happens almost every meeting that we talked with each other.
So I want to pose a similar version of the same question to Nigel, but different, right? Because Nigel, you came in just as this was all taking off, right? You kind of preceded the arrival of the BARI idea itself with Monum by a year, maybe a year and a half, right? But you have the special vantage point of being inside that building, right? When David Luberoff was talking about, Menino suddenly unearthing Mayor Menino suddenly unearthing the phrase laser-like focus on data, right? He was implicitly talking about you and your colleagues who were, the new bench of leaders in his administration. How did that evolution look from inside the walls of City Hall? And how it continued into the Walsh administration and now the Janney administration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's in some ways, so we started our office around that time, the mayor's office of New Urban Mechanics, kind of specifically around that space, right? How do we, a few people have mentioned before that Boston has this rich network of resources, and we don't really tap it, in terms of the universities and other research organizations and so on. So I think a willingness, I think honestly, there was like a willingness to admit that we can't know everything ahead of time, right? That we're going to be diving in order to be able to take on the challenges that we need to in the 21st century. We need the capacity to invent, as has already been said. And I think that implicitly suggests that we need to be like the data will take us in the direction of where we need to be inventing, right? What are the social challenges that we need to be taking on in this moment? And that was certainly how neuromechanics started. And I think that's also how a lot of the energy with how BARI got started. There was a lot of energy, I think, David Lubroff, the influence. So in a lot of ways, a lot of my work has always been about, like, innovation is about people, both the people who do it and the people who are trying to impact. And I think it's the same situation here, that a lot of the people and the personalities who were in the mix at the time had a huge influence on the shape that it took. Rob and Chris and David and yourself and me. I think one of the things I remember most about those early days was the stories that David would tell, about, the history of Boston and what has worked and what has not worked. And it was full of like rich insights. And then, inevitably, like, Rob would jump in with a bunch of really interesting insights from Chicago. And it seemed like there's so much knowledge to be gained from all those different things. And so, this idea that data gives us insight into what's happening in the communities, and sometimes they are counterintuitive, the insights, right? One of the first crazy things that we were working on peripherally, I know this now in your book, was this whole idea of broken windows, right? A lot of neuromechanics was founded on broken windows, right? This idea, I'm not going to touch it because I know that you wrote a whole book on this, but that this was a viable social theory that could be applied to government, right? You fix the tactical to have this longer term strategic impact in communities and so on. But those were the kinds of stories that we were diving into to see, do they actually work the way that we think they do? And so in those early days, there was a lot of exploration of these kinds of topics, and it was just a really interesting time. And we were pulling together partners, and it's difficult work, right? Because, like, as Holly said, the data is hard to find, and finding with the people with the right temperament to be able to ask these questions in an open-ended way, that's also hard to do. And the way that we think about problems in government and the way that we think about problems in academia is very different. Time horizons are different. The community's concerns are very different, and so it was an interesting and heady time to be doing this kind of work.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point to your point about exploration. And right, I've seen you give talks about Monum probably 2 or 3 dozen times, and you often talk about how you guys are the one place at City Hall where you're allowed to and even encouraged to fail, right, and try things out. And I think if I think back to 2011. Something that was very unique about our conversations as an academic and policymaker, a team of academics and a team of policymakers sitting and chatting, is we threw hypotheses at each other, right? Mm-hmm. And debated them. And I love when I give my own talks on the history of like the 311 project and stuff, I often lead off with, well, we had an argument about like this was a civic act, and then my whole idea that maybe this was territoriality and people just wanting to take care of their neighborhoods. And I were really going back and forth on that and not agreeing, and basically agreeing to go look at the data together, which is sort of unique in, or at least, compared to traditional, right? Same old academic policymaker collaboration. That's not really the way it would go. Either the policymaker would outsource the hypothesis development to the academic, or basically had a thing they want to find and want the academic to find it. But it wasn't, it was so different. And I think it's something that you see now in all agencies and all nonprofits, to one extent or another, where you can sit down with people throughout Boston and say, well, let's figure out the 4 different ways that could be explained, and build on it. And that's a really, I think, special cultural shift that you guys got to be a part of. I want to turn to Rob, because Nigel, you mentioned Rob's expertise on Chicago, and he's now an expert in Boston and Chicago and probably cities. But Rob, as Chris mentioned, and as probably many people in the audience know, you led a seminal social science project in Chicago that has, I lose track, but I mean, papers from, I think there's something like 200 papers that cite the database that you guys developed, and one of your papers from it has 12,000 citations, something to that effect. So it really was transformative academically, and I believe it's been transformative in terms of policy and practice as well. I mean, police officers know what collective efficacy is, which in other worlds could just end up being a term that ends up in, the social science apocrypha. How do you see the legacy of PhDCN impacting policy and practice? And do you think there are lessons in there for this group and this community, and how we've been able to sort of merge research and policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods is both similar and different, right? So it started out in the mid-1990s. It's similar in the sense that at that time, we too were grappling with how to pull together this unusual interdisciplinary project. In that case, it was really focused on data collection around multiple cohorts of kids, and a deep dive on the study of communities in Chicago with multiple kinds of tools for collecting data, such as community surveys, systematic social observation. And a lot of that, right, is kind of carried over into BARI. So the sort of creating the team and the confidence to carry out a project, I think there's real similarities there, even though it was a data collection project. The other thing that I think is similar is the importance of community. I mean, it's probably not that well known, but even at the time, we were intensely involved with trying to collaborate with the community. We had a director of community relations who was deeply involved with trying to bring the community on board. So there's that similarity. But in terms of like how a project evolves in the relationship to policy, well, I guess what I take from it, and I think this is true of BARI too, is really the importance of ideas. And I mentioned that in my first comment, because one way to think about policy is policy evaluation. Does this program work? Does it not work? You conduct some kind of experiment or whatever and evaluate programs. That's how a lot of people think of policy. I think BARI, and this goes to a couple of points that were just made in your point, Dan, arguing with Nigel, was grappling with ideas and putting them to work with data. So the broken windows thesis, and I've weighed in on that myself. That's how I think you influence policy, but also thinking. In other words, it's about changing the way that people think. And one of the successes, I believe, BARI has been to change the conversation, not just about broken windows, but about multiple things, about the importance of data, about community collaborations, teaching the community how to use data, right? I mean, we've had training sessions. You take, again, an idea like broken windows. Well, how do you measure it? What does it mean? Or what are the other characteristics of communities that are important? And what do residents see in data that we don't see? So that's, I think, very important and potentially influential in policy, but it also affects theory. It affects how social scientists. So it's this going back and forth. It's, I think, very much a part of, it's really the fundamental ethos. It's sort of in the water. It's like what we've been drinking for the last 10 years. I think it works pretty well.
Thanks, Rob. So I want to build on this idea of like thinking together, right? And figuring out what it is we want to do collaboratively and build. And actually, I'm going to start breaking order here. I'm going to jump back over to Nigel. in a sense, right, the early days of this whole thing, right, this research policy data collaboration idea, it angled up early on with smart cities, which is a term I think most of the people on the panel don't love. I'm just going to go there, we don't love it. If I'm speaking for the royal we right now as me, why do I not love smart cities? It's because it's a buzzword for what's futuristic, flashy, and efficient, right? And it really fails to encapsulate all of the great things we could do with data and technology, right? You use it to pursue equity, to pursue democracy, to pursue inclusivity, and to pursue resilience and justice and all these things. Because, you can optimize for any function you want, right? Engineers terms. And I guess if we're thinking in our timeline, right, we've been talking a lot 10 years ago, 9 years ago, we're thinking about, the way things have shifted from where we started to where we are now. Where did we find that transition, right? When did we figure out that we could do more than something that was just reaching for a wired headline, right? Something more than the flash.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can say personally how that changed for me, but in terms of how, in terms of our conversations and maybe the dialogue at large changed. I think,
and actually, Nigel, I'd love to hear, and I bet the audience would love to hear, how did that change personally for you? Like when did you commit to that?
It was really basically Mayor Menino. When I started doing this job, I had no idea, right? I was sort of a programmer type guy who had been in startups and things. I had no idea what local government was or did, but I was interested in finding out. And then I finally I learned from Mayor Menino and my colleagues that our job is to make people's lives better, right? That was his vision. It was his articulation was our job is really just to make people's lives better. And when you started looking at a lot of these technologies, the question was, are they actually making people's lives better? And the answer was, we don't know, right? And so I think that was a starting point for thinking that this is a really interesting opportunity for research to see, does it actually help? Because one of the challenges, a lot of vendors, they would show up and make claims about the impact of these things, and they would frame it in their own terms, but the answer seemed to be sort of, but not really. And so that was how it changed for me. It was like, what is my job? Is my job just about efficiency and saving money? And it was very clear from the mayor that's not really our job. I mean, it's not that we're against efficiency. The world, I mean, we could use some more efficiency, but at the end of the day, it's not just about saving money. It's about making people's lives better. And sometimes those two things are different, right? Saving money and impacting people's lives are you do different things to do those two things, to have those two kinds of impacts. And so I think that once we could be honest about that, like one of the interesting things for me about BARI has always been your and everybody's willingness to combine quantitative and qualitative, right? So it's not just about the numbers. It's also about, like, we're starting with people's lives, right? Like, we're not doing this for an abstract concept. It's about making the world better, right? And so with that as a framework, then I think you ask different questions about from the data that you're seeing. And and you start to think differently about the technology that's being deployed, and you interrogate it differently, and you start introducing new concepts like trust, right? I mean, although there's a lot of social science concepts out there that, up till that point, I had not really heard used in a government context, but trust is a thing. You can measure trust, right? And so once we started looking at systems like 311 through that lens, or some of the work that I was doing with Eric Gordon at the time, it took on a very different hue, and I think there was a willingness to ask different kinds of questions and so on. So that's when it changed for me. Yeah.
Holly, I'm going to pose the same question to you as you know, you moved from, or led at the MAPC and then moved over to the state. How have you seen that same transition occur?
Well, I think in general, society's changed over that time. And, one of the things I was looking at was the, like, what were the headlines in 2011, trying to remind myself what was happening. And, Occupy Wall Street was the protest movement at that time. That is a very different protest than the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that we're having now. And it just feels very different. It's just the reality is it's very personal and tangible, and the stories that we hear are just heartbreaking, and then also so illustrative of what's happening with systematic racism in our society. And it's very different than the Occupy Wall Street, which is very heady and sort of abstract. And so I think one of the things that we moved from smart cities is this very stale, sort of whitewash, no pun intended, tech version of what should happen in cities. And we often make the assumption that technology is colorblind, and it's not. It reflects the bias of the people. Data and technology reflect the bias of the people who build it or use it. And so I think as you start to look at data and talk to community members, you start to understand the perspectives, the value, and the reality that having more people in the room looking at the data from the community brings to the truth to the situation. And so I think as you just start to think about, what is this data telling us? How should we interpret this? What does the community need? How are we going to help the community? How are they going to help us figure out what the answers are? How are they going to create their own answers? It's an interesting conversation to go back and forth with. And it's just much more rich, and it's much more, I think, impactful, versus I think the smart cities is just very, I don't know, sterile, I guess.
That's fair. I want to move from there. I think you've given a great lead in actually to Amari here and his expertise. And Amari, I do want to note what's really different about your organization from the others on the panel, right? I feel like everyone else on the panel in their professional role started with data and or research or technology and then developed purpose, right? Whereas what you're doing with King Boston, you're starting with purpose and mission, and then acknowledging that research and data could really help you to achieve and make the case and advocate and all those things. So how do you think about how we transition this to the current moment?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that Holly said just struck with me and stuck me and kind of hit me. I think we've been looking at this in a very positivist way, that this technology is inherently good, and that this is just, we do this will happen. And this moment in time, I think, has illuminated the ways in which racism is endemic in all the things that we do. And so, Nigel said a few times, this opportunity to interrogate things that we think are inherently right, because it's rooted in a socialization that's founded in racism. And so how do we imagine this opportunity to interrogate every single thing we do and determine whether we move forward with it in a democratic society? And so I think as we think about King Boston building a monument, on the one hand, it is a phenomenal, I'm biased, it's a phenomenal 3-story monument in Boston Common to honor the Kings and other civil rights leaders. But it's also a conversation to interrogate the ways in which symbols throughout the city socialize us subliminally and consciously into ways of thinking and being. Mayor Mitch Landrieu talks about the statue of Robert E. Lee looking over the city of New Orleans, and what does that say about a city, right? And so what does a statue, a monument to honor the Kings and other civil rights leader in America's first park say about the values of Boston? And so that same purview is how we're also looking at data research and grassroots organizing. And I like this framing that Holly brought up, the real difference between Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street. This is a different context. It's compounded by us experiencing a moment of mindfulness, and that mindfulness was caused by us just trying not to die in a pandemic. And so we've had an opportunity to reflect in a way, to internalize what we've seen in a way that's been different from an Occupy. There hadn't been an occasion for us to stop and interrogate it. Is the way that we've researched this is different. And so one thing about King Boston is that we have internalized, both theoretically, methodologically, and practically, critical race theory as our operating model for us as a nonprofit and a research entity. And so that premise, the first tenet of CRT, is that racism is endemic. And so that shapes the way in which we look at our move forward in how we conduct research, who's involved in the research, who's doing the research. One thing we talk about, there's been a couple of articles about this emergence of Black leadership, new Black nonprofits, new Black civic leaders, first Black mayor. Who does the research matters. And there's a perspective of researchers embodying the experiences of those living in the complications that's important to frame the discourse. And I think that's another opportunity for us to take forward with us in this moment, is change the faces in the next BARI video 10 years from now and have it look a little bit more brown, have it look a little bit more gendered in a different way. And when I say gendered, I mean in all the ways that we define what gender is today that we didn't 10 years ago, orientation, spirit, ethnicity, etc. And so I think that's the opportunity for the research. And when we think about it at the Center for Economic Justice and our research apparatus, it's grounded in community. It's asset-based. We're not looking to produce data to say, well, here's evidence of challenges. We actually want to uncover how people are surviving and elevate and amplify how they're making it work. Inevitably, in the journey to amplify what's working, we'll have to address problems that are barriers. But this asset-based approach to cities, particularly for historically minoritized citizens and residents, is I think, an important framing for us to take forward and has the potential to shape future discourse.
That's great. Thanks, Amari. And I love your point about, who's involved in the research matters, right? It defines the questions, it defines how you collect the data. It's funny, it's a very social scientific adage, but there is no data without theory. And in practical or policy implicated research, kind of means there's no data without the purpose, right? Without the question, without the perspective on what needs to be asked and answered here. And I think that's really important. And I agree with your point. The montage, of course, reflects, it reflects a certain representative and who answered my emails, but it could be more brown, it could be more gendered, absolutely, and to have that emerging now and in the coming years is going to be really important to us as a community. We have about 10 minutes left, and there's two other things I wanted to hit on together, one of which I didn't even have in the original plan, so the panelists haven't heard me ruminate about this yet, but it stuck out to me during the montage with comments from particularly Catherine Lusk and Kim Lucas, who, interestingly enough, are both also alums of City Hall, and they both mentioned this sort of ability to train the next generation of experts, right? And to see them coming, and they referenced that Nigel and his colleagues, Chris Carter, Chris Osgood, Catherine herself, all came out in a certain cohort, and Devin Lyons Quirk, of folks who were kind of this first generation, if you will. And I don't know if we're saying we're in the second or the third generation now with Kim Lucas and Taylor Kane and others. And we have a master's program at Northeastern where we're training students in urban informatics, and other programs around the city are doing all this. So we're seeing waves of these young leaders, right? And I guess I just want to pose to the panel, right? Maybe define the question as you will. How do we continue to do that effectively in both academia and policy and nonprofits? what does that next generation of leaders look like that embodies this intersection of research, data, policy, practice, community? What are your thoughts on who that next generation is that's coming out right now, and what their leadership is going to look like? And I guess, Rob, as the academic on the panel, I want to pop over to you on the education piece, and then kind of go across.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're absolutely right that the future is in the young, and how do we bring that about in creative and new ways? I guess as an academic, a teacher, professor, one thing I would say is this. In my experience, I've taught courses over the last 10 years or more, but in particular over the last decade. I've taught a number of courses on urban, let's call it urban sociology. One was a gen ed course taught with David Luberoff, who also taught with Chris. I've taught courses on crime in the city. And in every case, I can say that students get incredibly excited about these ideas. They get excited about BARI. And in fact, the way I teach my courses is that I have students, they are required, first of all, to get out into the community. So in a sense, I sort of try to embody the spirit of BARI in my teaching. They have to go to neighborhoods in Boston. They have to get out of the bubble of Harvard Square. It's incredible. There's students, some of them tell me, like, I've never been into Boston, or I've never been to these neighborhoods. They have to observe them. They have to engage with BARI's data. They have to get on IQSS, Dataverse. They have to engage with a lot of the questions we've been talking about. And it's a little frustrating sometimes for them at first, but I can tell you that at the end of the day, they love it. And I've had a number of students become interns in government, in nonprofits. And so to me, that's just a signal. That's data that's telling me that there's a hunger out there in the next generation. They absolutely engage. So that's a mechanism. And I think we need to do more of that, and we need to think outside the box. And if you think about a lot of, I'm thinking about Amari's comments too, and Holly about the protests. A lot of it is coming from the younger generation, not only, but the same is true of climate change. Like, it's kind of a wake-up call to a lot of us, and I think that's inspiring. But I think there's a lot of engagement that could be had in terms of cross-generational mentorship, training in the use of data, like I've described in terms of courses. And then again, thinking outside of the box in ways that we might not imagine. And I'll just end with an example from BARI, and I'm going to embarrass you, Dan, in the sense it goes back to Chris's point. In 2010, I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk at Binghamton by David Sloan Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist. I'm a sociologist, criminologist. I've always been open to interdisciplinary thought. But when I gave that talk afterwards, I went out to dinner with David and a bunch of graduate students, and Dan was one of them. We had an engaging conversation. Oh, this guy's really smart. So I went back and read some of your work and came back, and as Chris noted, here I am in a social science environment, sociology department. This is an evolutionary biologist. This is different. This is engaging, intellectually stimulating. Let's try it and look what happened. Now, I'm not saying we should go out and look for more evolutionary biologists. I'm saying there's all kinds of people out there that we normally don't look at. And I think that's part of the comments that Amari made, both with regard to race and gender. I'm just expanding it intellectually, generationally. So I'm actually pretty optimistic, because I think there's a ton of talent and a ton of latent interest that just needs to be.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. And if I can, so two things. One, I remember that dinner as well, and I obviously experienced it differently as the grad student trying to, get time talking to Rob Sampson. And but the other thing I'll note as a selfish plug for the panels after this. So there's someone who, perfectly to your point, a real great leader in this space, Nathan Sanders, who's speaking on the environmental justice panel after this. He's a physicist. He got his PhD in physics and said he wanted to use data and his analytic tools to benefit society. And here he is. I wonder if he's in the audience right now and hears me talking about him. But I think you're exactly right. There's so much diverse talent out there in so many different ways to be sort of brought in. Holly, you have mentored so many people over the last 10 years and before that who are now leaders in this space. I mean, Tim Reardon, for example, who has mentored tons of people himself, was your deputy for years. But then so many others at the state, Kurt Savoy, Connor McKay, who's I just think, Harlan Weber, right? All these people who have now become leaders in their own right and mentors. How do you see the mentorship process in this kind of continuing to foment cultural change?
First of all, the individuals you mentioned, I'd say mentorship really goes both ways, right? And I think that's one of the things we have to remember with the up and coming leaders is that, we really have to learn from the new leaders that we're helping to form. Yeah, so I think mentorship is critically important. I do think it's really important for us to help people gain perspective and context broader than what their current experience is. And I think, one of the things that's really important with mentorship is really helping them understand the fundamentals of often where we come from in our different sort of educational backgrounds and our different trainings. I mean, I do think there is something fundamentally important about rigorous data work, right? So, we can add spin all we want to data in this day and age, and a lot of people do. But what's really important is the rigorous scientific method and explain your methodology to peers and debating with your peers and having people look at what you did. And so often it's just reminding people, what are the fundamentals we need to look at here? What are the methodologies we need to use? How do we maintain that and respect for communities? And I think helping to ignite that curiosity that we all have, and then how do you continue that curiosity for learning and making a better community within your professional life and whatever form that takes. And so, for example, when I joined Sasaki, which is a global design firm that designs beautiful buildings, campuses, designs neighborhoods, one of the reasons I joined them is because they just have such a great understanding of not only how to contribute and design beautiful neighborhoods and communities, but also how do you ignite that passion for a better community, better design, better environment in its employees, and how do you nurture that? They have research grants, they have internal research grants where people get to explore different ideas. The Sasaki Foundation has great work that it enables them to do with some other up-and-coming leaders through our mentorship and programming with interns for high school students. So I think thinking about how we can bring the leaders up with us, help instill the basics with them, and then let them go, and then learn from them the lessons they can teach us back. So, yeah.
All right, I'm going to jump to Amari, and I'm recognizing we're going to go over time by a couple minutes. I apologize to everyone. Apparently, that's my prerogative as both moderator and host. But Amari, building on both the points of Rob about kind of diverse expertise and Holly's point about mentoring and getting people to understand context. What do you see as the best mechanisms right now to really broaden this leadership? And are there models out there that you've seen that you think can be really effective for us as a community?
I think, again, hopefully I don't sound like a broken record, but the opportunity post-pandemic is to decide what we want to bring forward and what we want to leave behind. And so I oftentimes think about Victor Ray's theory of racialized organizations and try to conceptualize, what are we trying to bring people, what environment are we trying to bring diverse candidates, diverse learners, diverse thinkers into? If the organization itself is not kind to the type of new thinking, this idea of diversity and inclusion is already lost at the battle. We have to also interrogate the structures in which we're trying to diverse. And so we've often heard this defund the police conversation, this discourse, and even policy in Massachusetts really centered around what do we need for peacekeeping? Because police forces are self-regulating systems where those in charge internally are the ones that promote, punish, and elevate their own. Higher education is also a system that's self-regulating, that promotes, trains, and tenures folks on its own too. And so how do we interrogate the systems in which we are elevating to? And when we think about this idea of engaged scholarship, the data around the vast majority of scholars of color who don't get tenured when they present engaged scholarship because it's viewed as research and service and not scholarship is also something worth noting as we think about who are we welcoming into these systems, what's knowledge, whose knowledge is valid and who isn't, what are assets that these systems of training and preparation, how welcoming are they, and are we validated when we enter those structures? I think it's worth noting. And so this opportunity of a racial reckoning also has to extend into the systems that train folks to, and I say this as a doctoral candidate and a trustee of a university. So this is my higher ed involvement. We have to interrogate systems of training and what is knowledge and what's not knowledge. And I think that fundamental question will shape our pathway and direction moving forward, both in solutions, both in the engagement of technology, both in the expectations of those who are doing the research being engaged. As a community leader, if I didn't go to community meetings that had nothing to do with the work that I did, I would lose validity as a community leader, as a community organizer. And so how do we challenge those who want to engage in the research to also engage in community beyond the research and engage in a way that practices empathy, because the experiences of those in the community might not belong to them, but practices collaboration and connectedness by engaging in the type of community meetings where that data is articulated every day. So I think that's the promise and the opportunity moving forward. I think there are a lot of organizations that are thinking of ways in which they're interrogating their programs, their training apparatuses, their organizations as they're thinking about how do we include diverse voices, diverse citizens, diverse residents into conversations without interrogating the organizations, the institutions, the structures in which we're asking them to diverse. Racism has an interesting way of replicating and reproducing by having us thinking we're doing something different. And I think that feels like the opportunity for us moving forward beyond that. That feels like an important part in the next 10 years.
Great. Thanks, Amari. So I do need to wrap this up real quick, but Nigel, I'm going to give you the penultimate word. You get 30 seconds. As a leader in this space and someone who's mentored a lot of people, and there's a lot of graduate students probably in the audience, what's your message to them, whether they want to go academia, policy, nonprofit? What's your message to them and how to have impact in the next 10 years?
Certainly connect with your community, as Amari has said. Engage people who have done this work already, people like ourselves, but there's others beyond this. And the one pattern I've seen that's different now than I saw years ago is that there's a difference in the nature of the energy. I think activists are coming to the space. And so the job for us, I think, moving forward is to figure out how we hybridize government innovation, whatever that is, and the energy of activism and all the concepts and the frameworks that they're bringing to the table.
That's great. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you, everybody. I get to mingle my roles as host and moderator here for a moment. So first, just a reminder to everyone, we're going to have the topical panels starting at 11 o'clock. We've got some great ones for you today on environmental justice, on who gets to call Greater Boston home. So some really great ones today. And then a reminder too, to join us next Friday for the conversation with the mayoral candidates, a really unique opportunity for us to engage with these emerging leaders. I mean, they're already leaders, but continuing leaders to think about how research policy influences their work. But setting that aside, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the panel for doing this with us this morning, but also for being partners for the last 10 years and being partners moving forward. For me personally, it's been so much fun working with you all. Rob and Chris for their original vision, along with Deans Gross and Cohen, to make this possible, and Dean Poiger for the support over the last 5 years. And thank you to all of you in the audience, right? Obviously, we couldn't have everybody up here, but in reality, if this had been a normal year, we'd be having drinks right now and just celebrating because this has all been done collaboratively and collectively. And the reason we do this conference every year is because it's not just about one cadre of researchers and policymakers doing a handful of projects together. It's about broad-based collaboration and broad-based respect for each other's work and a group project. I'll give one more comment and then we'll wrap up. I remember years ago when I was in graduate school, I was at a conference and someone asked this philosopher about evolutionary psychology, asked him what he thought about it. It was an evolutionary psychology conference. And he said, I think it's a really interesting project. And it's funny, at that point in my career, I understood projects as like that one thing you write one paper about. And it made me realize that a project can be a much bigger and broader thing. And I think that we have a beautiful project here as a collective in figuring out how to use data, technology, merge it with policy and practice to really create the society that we want to live in, that we want our children to live in, and that is the place where we want to be. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I'm so glad that I've been able to do this with all of you for the past 10 years and for the coming 10 years. So again, thank you. Hope to see many of you in the topical panels in a few minutes, and many of you next week for the conversation with the mayoral candidates. And one last time, thank you to the panel. Your thoughts this morning were fantastic. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. See everybody.